In the year 1177, in the dry, rocky hills near the city of Ramla in the Holy Land, something amazing was about to happen, an event that would break all the rules of medieval war, shock even the smartest military planners, and prove that sometimes history is made not by the biggest armies, but by the bravest soldiers. This is the story of the Battle of Montgisard. It's a fight that very few people know about, but it changed the entire course of the Crusades and showed how a secret weapon could destroy one of the largest armies ever gathered in the medieval Middle East. Imagine the scene for a moment. It is the 12th century, during the height of the Crusades. The Holy Land is like a boiling pot of conflict, weak partnerships, and empire-building dreams. On one side, we have the Crusader states, broken apart and always in danger. On the other side, there's a rising Muslim leader who is bringing his power together and getting ready to unite the Islamic world under his command. This man is Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. His name is already starting to create fear among Christians and hope among Muslims. He is ambitious, smart, and most of all, determined to kick the Crusaders out of the Holy Land. But before we jump into the battle itself, we need to understand the political and military situation that made this fight unavoidable. Since the First Crusade, which ended with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusader states had built a shaky presence in the area. These kingdoms were basically Christian islands in a Muslim ocean. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa formed a defensive line that depended both on impressive forts and on fights among their enemies to survive. For many years, this plan worked pretty well. Muslim rulers were often more interested in fighting each other than joining forces against the European invaders. But everything started to change when Nur ad-Din, the Atabeg of Aleppo, began a unification project that would continue after his death. And who would take over this project? Saladin. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved quickly to bring together power in Egypt and Syria, creating a united force that was the biggest threat to the Crusader states since they were founded. Now let's turn our attention to the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177. Who ruled this critical kingdom? Here we meet one of the saddest and most fascinating people of the Crusades, King Baldwin IV. Baldwin was no ordinary king. He was crowned at 13 years old, and even at that young age he was facing a death sentence. Baldwin had leprosy, a disease that at the time was thought to be a curse from God, and that slowly weakened the body. But make no mistake, despite his worsening physical condition, Baldwin had a sharp, strategic mind and a courage that impressed even his enemies. This young king, whose very life was being eaten away by disease, was about to face the biggest challenge of his life. If you're enjoying this historical content, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment about the time you watched this video. Your participation will greatly help the channel grow and continue to bring you fascinating stories like this. In October 1177, Saladin gathered a huge army with a clear and bold goal: to invade the Kingdom of Jerusalem and possibly capture the Holy City itself. Historical records differ on the exact size of his force, but the most reliable numbers suggest he commanded about 26,000 soldiers. To put this in perspective, This was a massive army by medieval standards. It was a force made up of elite Mamluk cavalry, mounted archers, experienced infantry, and troops from several provinces under Saladin's control. This army had been put together with great effort, bringing together groups from Egypt, Syria, and other regions. The message was clear. Saladin was showing his power and his ability to bring together resources on a scale the Crusaders could not match. Saladin's strategy was clever. He knew that a large part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military forces were spread out. Baldwin had sent many troops north to help defend other Crusader regions against threats. This left the heart of the kingdom open to attack. Saladin planned to attack with speed and overwhelming force, destroying the territory before the Crusaders could properly respond. His army crossed the border and began systematically plundering the coastal region, coming dangerously close to Ascalon, a strategic Crusader fort on the southern coast. Baldwin, despite his youth and weakened physical condition, immediately recognized how serious the situation was. He was in Ascalon with a small garrison when he learned of Saladin's invasion. Baldwin's position was desperate. He had under his direct command only about 500 knights, a number that would be increased by a few hundred foot soldiers and archers, but still amounting to a force of less than 1,000 fighters. How do you face an army 26 times larger with such limited resources? The logical answer would be, don't fight. Any sensible commander would have locked himself in Ascalon, sent out urgent requests for help, and waited. But Baldwin was no ordinary commander. Here we need to understand the medieval military mentality, especially that of the knights of the military orders. Among the troops available to Baldwin was a group of the Knights Templar, led by Odo of Saint Amand, the order's Grand Master. The Templars were one of the most disciplined and feared military orders in all of Christendom, founded many years earlier to protect pilgrims. They had become an elite military force with superior training, exceptional equipment, and above all, an unshakable faith that made them fearless in battle. The Templars did not fear death. They welcomed it as a possible path to martyrdom and eternal salvation. Baldwin received crucial information from his scouts. Saladin, confident in his numerical advantage and apparently convinced that Baldwin would not dare leave Ascalon, had allowed his army to spread out throughout the region to maximize plunder and destruction. This was a classic tactical error. When a commander becomes overconfident, when he assumes the enemy will act predictably, he creates weaknesses. Saladin's troops were not in battle formation. They were spread out, busy looting villages and collecting supplies. Some soldiers were even resting, confident that there would be no immediate fight. Baldwin saw a narrow window of opportunity. If he could move his forces quickly and strike before Saladin reorganized his scattered army, maybe, just maybe, he could do enough damage to force a retreat. But there was a big problem. Baldwin's forces were at Ascalon, but Saladin's army was farther north, near an area known as Montgisard, near Ramla. Baldwin needed to move his troops secretly and with extreme speed, which in itself was an extraordinary challenge. The decision was made. Baldwin, accompanied by the Templars and the Bishop of Bethlehem, who carried the kingdom's most sacred relic, a piece of the true cross, decided to march to meet Saladin. The true cross was more than a religious symbol. It was considered a source of divine power capable of granting victory to those who fought under its protection. The presence of this relic raised the coming battle from a military fight to a holy war, an existential struggle between good and evil in the medieval view. Baldwin's march was a masterpiece of tactical movement. His forces moved quickly, avoiding detection, using local knowledge of the land to remain hidden. Every hour was critical. If Saladin discovered the movement too early, he could easily regroup his troops and destroy the small Crusader force before it could even form for battle. But luck, or as the Crusaders believed, divine providence, was with Baldwin. He managed to position his forces undetected. Now, let's pause to consider what was going through Saladin's mind at that moment. He was at the height of a successful campaign. His troops had destroyed enemy territory without significant opposition. The local people were terrified. Riches were being collected. Everything pointed to this being another show of force that would further weaken the Crusader states. Saladin was an experienced commander, but even the best commanders can be caught off guard when they underestimate their opponent or allow early success to breed carelessness. On November 25, 1177, Baldwin's forces finally caught up with Saladin's army near Montgisard. The landscape was typical of the region. Low hills, partially open land with sparse plants and dusty paths winding between small rises. Saladin's army was, as expected, scattered. Some units were camped, others patrolled lazily, and many were busy gathering loot. Proper military formation was absent. Baldwin gathered his commanders for a brief war council. The strategy would be simple, but risky. They would attack with all available force, focusing their blow on what appeared to be the center of Saladin's camp, where the Muslim leader himself was based. The idea was to cause maximum shock and confusion, cut off the enemy army's leadership if possible, and create enough panic that Saladin's scattered forces would be unable to coordinate an effective response. It was an all-or-nothing strategy. If it failed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would lose its king and its best troops in a single catastrophic blow. The Templars positioned themselves at the front. These knights, dressed in full armor and white cloaks marked with the Red Cross, formed a charging wedge, the most devastating formation of medieval cavalry. Behind them, Baldwin himself, despite his physical limitations caused by leprosy, mounted his warhorse. The Bishop of Bethlehem held high the true cross. And in that moment, everyone present understood that they were not merely fighting for territory or political advantage. They genuinely believed they were fighting for their faith, their survival, and the will of God. The signal was given. The charge began. Imagine the sound of hundreds of horses galloping at the same time, the thunder of hooves against the dry ground, the creak of armor, the knights' war cries echoing across the hills. Crusader cavalry was as much a weapon of psychological warfare as it was physical. The impact of a medieval heavy cavalry charge was comparable to that of a modern tank in terms of brute force and demoralizing effect. The first units of Saladin's army were completely taken by surprise. Soldiers who were resting, eating, or organizing supplies suddenly found themselves face to face with armored horsemen charging at top speed. The initial shock was devastating. Entire lines of soldiers were trampled, pierced by spears, and crushed by war horses. Panic began to spread like wildfire. Saladin, upon realizing the attack, desperately tried to organize a defense. This was the ultimate test of his leadership. A lesser commander would have panicked and fled immediately, but Saladin was made of stronger stuff. He began shouting orders, trying to rally his scattered troops, forming pockets of resistance around his most experienced commanders and the Mamluk cavalry units that were his elite force. But here's the terrible truth of medieval battle. Once panic sets in, a scattered army is nearly impossible to bring back to order. Soldiers separated from their regular units didn't know where to go or who to follow. The confusion was total. Some groups tried to form defensive lines only to be outflanked and slaughtered. Others simply began to flee, and flight is contagious on a battlefield. The secret weapon that was destroying Saladin's army was not just the Crusaders' courage or military skill. It was something more fundamental, the deadly combination of tactical surprise, speed of execution, concentration of force at the critical moment, and the ruthless exploitation of an enemy's strategic error. Saladin had made the cardinal error of allowing his army to spread out in potentially hostile territory, assuming that its numerical superiority protected it from any threat. Baldwin had identified this vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. As the battle went on, Saladin's situation became increasingly desperate. His attempts to gather enough forces to mount an effective counterattack were repeatedly stopped by the speed and aggression of the Crusader attack. The Templars in particular fought with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural in the Muslim soldiers' perception. These were no ordinary warriors. They were trained fanatics who refused to retreat, refused to surrender, and fought to the point of exhaustion or death. The turning point came when a group of Templars managed to fight their way to the center of the battlefield, where Saladin was trying to coordinate his defense. For a terrifying moment, Saladin himself was in mortal danger. Contemporary accounts suggest he narrowly escaped death, possibly saved by his personal guard who sacrificed their lives to allow their commander to escape. This moment was crucial. When the soldiers saw that even the great Saladin was in danger and being forced to retreat, the last organized resistance began to collapse. What followed was a brutal pursuit. The Crusader forces, now with a momentum completely in their favor, chased Saladin's retreating army for miles. This phase of the battle was in many ways more deadly than the initial fight. Fleeing soldiers are easy targets. They cannot defend themselves well, often drop weapons and armor to run faster, and are vulnerable to attacks from behind. The Crusader cavalry cut through the retreating columns repeatedly, causing terrible carnage. The final toll from the Battle of Montgisard is staggering and, by modern standards, horrific. It is estimated that Saladin lost about 90% of his army. Of 26,000 men, perhaps only 2,000 or 3,000 managed to escape. Saladin himself was one of the survivors, but his escape was humiliating. He had to ride quickly to Egypt, accompanied only by a handful of guards, abandoning his army, his supplies, and his plans for conquest. It was the most crushing defeat of his career. On the Crusader side, losses were relatively light, though still significant. Probably a few dozen knights and hundreds of infantrymen were killed or wounded. But considering the huge difference in numbers, these losses were minor. Baldwin had achieved the impossible. With less than 1,000 men, he had destroyed an army more than 20 times larger. But let's take a deeper look at what really happened at Montgisard. What, after all, was the secret weapon that made this extraordinary victory possible? The answer isn't simple because there wasn't a single secret weapon, but rather a combination of factors that created the perfect conditions for an unlikely victory. First, we have intelligence and reconnaissance. Baldwin had accurate information about how spread out Saladin's army was. Without this information, he would never have risked the attack. This shows the vital importance of military intelligence, knowledge of the enemy, their position, and their readiness can be as important as the number of soldiers in the field. Second, the speed of mobilization and movement. Baldwin moved his forces with exceptional speed, covering considerable distances undetected. This ability to move troops quickly and secretly is an invaluable strategic advantage. Many battles are decided not by direct fighting, but by the movement that happens before the fight. Third, tactical surprise. Saladin did not expect to be attacked, especially by such a smaller force. This surprise took away the time he needed to properly organize his defense. Surprise in war is a force multiplier that can offset significant numerical disadvantages. Fourth, the quality of the troops. The Templars and Crusader Knights were professional warriors with superior training, better equipment, and exceptional discipline. In close combat, a well-trained and fully equipped Templar knight could easily overcome several less prepared opponents. Fifth, leadership. Baldwin, despite his youth and illness, showed exceptional leadership. He made a risky decision, executed it with precision, and inspired his troops to fight beyond their normal capabilities. Leadership at a critical moment can be the difference between victory and defeat. Sixth, the psychological element. The presence of the true cross and the Crusaders' genuine belief that they were fighting a holy war gave them morale and determination that overcame the will of their opponents. Never underestimate the power of belief and motivation in military conflict. Seventh, and perhaps most important, was Saladin's strategic error. His decision to spread out his forces created the vulnerability that Baldwin exploited. Even the greatest army is weak if it is divided and disorganized. Concentration of force at the decisive point is a fundamental principle of warfare that Saladin temporarily forgot in his overconfidence. The consequences of the Battle of Montgisard were deep and lasting. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it was literal salvation. Had Saladin succeeded in his invasion, the kingdom might have fallen decades earlier than it historically did. The victory gave the Crusaders precious time to strengthen their defenses and reorganize their forces. It also tremendously raised Baldwin's prestige. A king whom many had considered weak due to his illness had proven himself a brilliant and courageous military leader. For Saladin, Montgisard was a painful but crucial learning experience. He would never again underestimate his Crusader enemies. The defeat made him more cautious, more careful in his planning, but it didn't break him either. Saladin was resilient. He returned to Egypt, rebuilt his forces, and continued his campaign to unify the Muslim world. The defeat at Montgisard was a setback, not the end of his ambitions. It's fascinating to consider how this battle shaped later events. In the years that followed, Saladin and Baldwin would face off several more times. There was a mutual respect between them that went beyond their religious and political hatred. Saladin apparently admired Baldwin's courage, while Baldwin recognized Saladin's skill and honor. This was the paradoxical nature of medieval warfare. Mortal enemies on the battlefield could recognize each other's qualities. Baldwin's health continued to get worse in the years after Montgisard. Leprosy slowly destroyed his body. He went blind and lost the use of his hands and legs, but continued to rule through sheer willpower until his death in 1185. Even in his weakened condition, he remained a figure of authority and inspiration for his kingdom. His death left a leadership vacuum that contributed to the internal divisions that would eventually weaken the Crusader states. Saladin, for his part, would achieve his ultimate goal a decade after Montgisard. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he dealt the Crusaders a defeat as devastating as the one he himself had suffered at Montgisard. Hattin was the exact opposite of Montgisard. A small Crusader army, outnumbered and tactically outmatched, was destroyed by superior Muslim forces. After Hattin, Jerusalem would fall, and the Crusader states entered a period of decline, from which they would never fully recover. But here's the intriguing question we must consider. If Montgisard hadn't happened, if Saladin had succeeded in 1177, the history of the Crusades would have been completely different. Jerusalem might have fallen a decade earlier. The Crusader states might have collapsed sooner. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, might never have happened the way it did. A single battle, a decisive moment, changed the course of decades of history. This is the power and danger of war. Decisions made in seconds, actions carried out in hours, can have consequences that echo for generations. Montgisard teaches us that numbers are not everything in military conflict. Leadership, strategy, timing, and morale can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Overconfidence is a deadly danger, even for the most brilliant commander. Fortune favors the bold, but boldness must also be balanced with careful planning. The Battle of Montgisard also gives us a window into the medieval mindset. For the participants, this was not just a battle for territory or political power. It was a cosmic fight between good and evil, between true faith and error. This worldview, so different from the secular modern perspective, was what gave medieval fighters their extraordinary willingness to risk everything in battle. They genuinely believed they were fighting not just for kings and kingdoms, but for the salvation of their eternal souls. From a tactical military perspective, Montgisard offers lessons that remain relevant even in modern warfare. The importance of accurate intelligence, the advantage of taking initiative, the value of surprise, the danger of spreading out forces, and the need to maintain discipline and organization, even during offensive operations. These are universal truths of military conflict that go beyond technology and era. Consider also the role of individual leadership. In an era before modern communications, when orders were given by mounted messengers or visual signals, when the confusion of battle made coordination extremely difficult, the physical presence of the leader was crucial. Baldwin did not command from far away. He was present on the battlefield, visible to his troops, sharing their dangers. This leadership by personal example was a powerful motivator. Soldiers fight harder when they know their commander is with them, sharing the same risks. Maintaining discipline under extreme pressure is another remarkable aspect of Montgisard. The Templars, in particular, showed exceptional control. Even in the heat of battle, even when victory was within reach, they maintained formation and followed orders. This discipline allowed them to maximize their impact and minimize their own losses. Undisciplined armies, even victorious ones, often suffer unnecessary losses because individual soldiers pursue personal glory or plunder rather than maintain tactical formation. Logistics, though less dramatic than actual combat, also played a crucial role. Baldwin had to ensure his troops had enough supplies for the rapid march to Montgisard. Horses needed to be fed and kept in battle-ready condition. Armor and weapons needed to be in working order. These everyday details often determine the success or failure of military campaigns. A hungry or poorly equipped army, no matter how brave, is at a severe disadvantage. Geography also influenced the battle. The land near Montgisard, with its low hills and open areas, favored heavy cavalry. Had the battle taken place in more rugged land or in a densely wooded area, the tactical advantages of the Crusader Knights would have been significantly reduced. Competent commanders always consider how terrain will affect military operations and try to choose battlefields that favor their own forces. The timing of the battle in late November is also interesting. The climate in the Holy Land at this time of year is generally mild, avoiding both the extreme summer heat and the winter rains. This allowed for rapid troop movement without the additional challenges of bad weather conditions. At other times of the year, Saladin's campaign or Baldwin's response might have been limited by weather factors. We must also consider the psychological impact of the battle on the survivors on both sides. For the Crusader soldiers, Montgisard became a story of heroism and divine intervention that would be told and retold for generations. It strengthened their belief that God was on their side, that miracles were possible, that even against impossible odds, faith and courage could triumph. This story would strengthen Crusader morale in later conflicts. For the survivors of Saladin's army, the experience was traumatic. Many had seen friends and comrades killed, had fled in panic, and had experienced the humiliation of a devastating defeat. Some may have questioned whether their cause was just, whether Allah truly favored their efforts. But others, perhaps encouraged by Saladin himself, may have seen the defeat as a test, a trial that needed to be overcome through greater dedication and better preparation. The propaganda and historical story surrounding Montgisard is also fascinating. Crusader chroniclers naturally portrayed the battle as a miraculous victory, proof of divine favor. They emphasize the role of the true cross, Baldwin's courage, and the justice of his cause. Muslim chroniclers, on the other hand, had the difficult task of explaining how the great Saladin suffered such a defeat. Some downplayed how bad the disaster was, others blamed the defeat on circumstances or betrayal by subordinates. This manipulation of historical narrative to serve political and religious agendas is not unique to the medieval era. It remains a central aspect of how societies understand and interpret conflict. It's also important to recognize the limits of our knowledge about Montgisard. Primary sources are limited and often biased. We don't have detailed accounts of the battle from Saladin himself. Most of what we know comes from Christian chroniclers, who were interested in making the victory seem bigger. The exact number of troops involved, the precise course of the battle, Even the exact location of the battlefield are debated by historians. We must maintain appropriate humility about the certainty of our historical knowledge. That said, the general outline of events is reasonably well established. A small but elite Crusader force led by a sickly but determined young king managed to surprise and defeat a much larger Muslim army under Saladin. This unlikely victory had significant historical consequences, delaying the fall of Jerusalem and allowing the Crusader states to survive for another decade. When we analyze Montgisard through the lens of modern military theory, we can identify principles of warfare that were applied consciously or unconsciously by Baldwin and his commanders. The principle of economy of force, for example, was shown by concentrating limited resources on a single decisive blow, rather than spreading them across multiple smaller operations. The principle of surprise was maximized through secret movement and striking at the least expected moment. The principle of the offensive was fully embraced, with Baldwin choosing to attack rather than passively defend. The principle of unity of command was evident, with Baldwin maintaining clear control over all forces involved. On the other hand, Saladin violated several fundamental military principles at Montgisard. He failed to maintain adequate security, allowing an enemy army to approach undetected. He violated the principle of mass by spreading out his forces rather than keeping them together. He underestimated his opponent, failing to recognize the enemy's capabilities. These violations, taken together, created the conditions for the disaster that followed. The battle also shows the unpredictable nature of war. Even with careful planning, even with overwhelming numerical superiority, even with a brilliant commander like Saladin, the outcome of battles can be surprising. Factors such as troop morale, weather conditions, individual errors of judgment, and even pure luck can influence outcomes in ways that defy rational prediction. This is one reason why war should always be a last resort, because once begun, its course becomes partially random and uncontrollable. Thinking about Baldwin IV's character specifically, we find a truly extraordinary person. Here was a young man who by all medieval expectations should have been pushed aside or removed from power due to his illness. Leprosy was not only physically crippling, it carried enormous social and religious stigma. Many at the time believed the disease was divine punishment for sin. But Baldwin refused to allow his condition to define or limit him. He ruled with authority, led armies into battle, and earned respect even from his enemies. His story is proof of the power of human determination over difficult circumstances. It is reported that in the years after Montgisard, as his illness got worse, Baldwin had to be carried in a litter to the battlefield because he could no longer ride a horse. Even so, his presence inspired his troops. There is something deeply moving about a leader who continues to serve his people, even when his own body is failing. Baldwin literally gave everything, his health, his comfort, eventually his life, for the kingdom he swore to protect. Baldwin's relationship with the Templars also deserves further attention. The military orders, including the Templars and the Hospitallers, were essential pillars of the Crusader state's defense. They provided permanent professional forces in an era when most armies were made up of temporary feudal levies. The Templars owned vast estates in both the Holy Land and Europe, giving them substantial financial resources. They maintained strategic fortresses, and provided the military backbone of the Crusader states. Without them, it is doubtful whether the Crusader kingdoms could have survived as long as they did. At Montgisard, the Templars showed why they were so highly valued. Their initial charge broke enemy resistance and created the panic that led to the collapse of Saladin's army. Their discipline maintained the momentum of the attack even when they would have been tempted to stop to loot or chase individual targets. Their willingness to fight to the death eliminated the possibility of an early retreat that could have turned victory into defeat. They were, in essence, the decisive weapon Baldwin used at Montgisard. It's interesting to contrast the nature of the Crusader forces with the Muslim forces at Montgisard. Saladin's army was diverse, made up of groups from different regions with varying levels of training, equipment, and motivation. Coordinating such a mixed force was a significant challenge, even under ideal circumstances. When surprise and panic were added to the equation, this diversity became a weakness. Different units reacted differently. Some fought, others fled immediately, and few were able to coordinate effectively with neighboring units. The Crusader army, though much smaller, was more uniform. The Templars operated under a unified command and shared tactical doctrine. The secular knights, though from different noble families, shared a common military culture and had often trained and fought together before. This social and military unity gave them a significant quality advantage that partly offset their numerical inferiority. We must also consider the role of military technology at Montgisard. The armor of the Crusader knights was among the most advanced in the medieval world. Full chain mail, supplemented in some cases with metal plates in vulnerable areas. Heavy helmets and sturdy shields all provided exceptional protection. A fully armed knight was nearly invulnerable to common medieval infantry weapons, especially when mounted and moving. Cavalry lances, when used by a knight charging at maximum speed, had devastating piercing power. Long swords allowed superior reach and cutting force. This technological advantage, while not absolute, was certainly significant. Training also cannot be underestimated. Becoming a knight required years of preparation, beginning in childhood. Young nobles served as pages and squires, learning horsemanship, weapons handling, military tactics, and the code of chivalry. The Templars added a religious dimension and monastic discipline to this secular training. The result was elite warriors whose individual skills and ability to operate as a unified unit were better than most opponents they faced. In contrast, many of the soldiers in Saladin's army were recent levies, peasants and townspeople drafted into military service with minimal training. Even his most experienced troops, including the Mamluk cavalry, did not necessarily have the same level of unity and coordinated training that the Templars had. This difference in individual combat quality was a crucial factor at Montgisard. The issue of looting and pillage also deserves consideration. Part of the reason Saladin's army was scattered was that medieval soldiers often expected payment through plunder. Allowing troops to plunder enemy territory was a form of payment and incentive. But this also created tactical vulnerability, as Montgisard dramatically showed. Baldwin, by keeping his forces together and disciplined, gave up immediate opportunities for material gain in favor of tactical effectiveness. This choice was proven right by the outcome of the battle. The logistical aspects of the recovery after Montgisard are also fascinating. Saladin had to return to Egypt and completely rebuild his army. This required recruiting new soldiers, training replacements for lost commanders, restocking equipment and supplies, and restoring morale and confidence. This process took months, during which Saladin was vulnerable to attack. That the Crusaders did not take advantage of this vulnerability more aggressively is interesting and perhaps reflects their own resource limits. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the victory at Montgisard provided a crucial breathing space, but did not solve its fundamental problems. The kingdom was still outnumbered, still dependent on reinforcements from Europe, and still faced threats from multiple directions. The victory bought time, but it did not change the long-term strategic situation that would eventually lead to the fall of Jerusalem a decade later. It's tempting to think about alternative scenarios. What if Saladin had kept his army together? What if he had established adequate reconnaissance to detect Baldwin's approach? What if the weather had been bad, preventing the Crusader cavalry charge? What if Baldwin had decided to remain defensive in Ascalon? Any of these factors could have changed the outcome completely. This sensitivity to details and individual decisions is characteristic of critical historical moments. Montgisard's memory lasted for centuries after the event. For Christian Europeans, it became an inspiring example of how faith and courage could overcome impossible odds. Baldwin was remembered as a tragic hero, a virtuous king whose life was cut short by illness, but who never allowed his physical problems to lessen his spirit. For the Muslim world, Montgisard was ultimately seen as a temporary setback in Saladin's glorious career, a learning moment that made him a better and more cautious commander. Modern archaeology has tried to pinpoint the exact site of the Battle of Montgisard, but with limited success. Medieval battles rarely leave lasting physical traces. Bodies were buried or left to decompose. Weapons and armor were often collected for reuse, and temporary structures like camps quickly disappeared. Without permanent markers or distinctive geographic features, identifying ancient battlefields is extremely challenging. This means that much of what we know about Montgisard comes from historical texts rather than physical evidence. Contemporary chroniclers on both sides left accounts of the battle, though with significant differences in detail and interpretation. William of Tyre, the leading Latin chronicler of the time, described Montgisard as a divine miracle, emphasizing the role of the true cross and Baldwin's piety. Muslim chroniclers, including Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, who served as Saladin's secretary, acknowledged the defeat but tried to downplay its importance and preserve Saladin's reputation. These differences remind us that all history is written from a particular perspective and serves specific purposes. Thinking about Montgisard's broader legacy, we can see how a single battle can have ripples of consequences that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. The battle affected diplomatic negotiations, influenced Crusader recruitment in Europe, changed views about the viability of the Crusader states, impacted the path of Saladin's career, and entered the body of literature on chivalry and heroism that would influence European culture for centuries. A battle that lasted just a few hours on a November day in 1177 echoed across generations. We must also consider the human cost of Montgisard. Behind the statistics and numbers were thousands of individuals, each with their own story, hopes, fears, and loved ones. The soldiers who died at Montgisard left widows and orphans, grieving parents, and weakened communities. For every number on a casualty list was a personal tragedy. This human dimension of war is often lost in stories that focus on strategy and tactics, but it is essential to fully understanding the true cost of conflict. The question of justice and morality in war also inevitably comes up when studying events like Montgisard. From the Crusader perspective, they were defending Christian territory and holy places against aggression. From the Muslim perspective, they were trying to reclaim lands that had been conquered by foreign invaders. Both sides genuinely believed that God was on their side, that their cause was just, and that their opponents were wrong. This mutual moral certainty is characteristic of many religious conflicts and makes peaceful resolution extremely difficult. From a modern historical perspective, we can recognize the moral complexity of the Crusades without necessarily supporting the actions of either side. We can admire the individual courage and military skill of figures like Baldwin and Saladin while mourning the suffering their wars caused. We can study the tactics and strategies used at Montgisard as military lessons while recognizing the human tragedy the battle represented. Montgisard's study also reminds us of the importance of primary historical sources and rigorous methods in military history. It's tempting to create dramatic stories that simplify complex events, but good historians resist this temptation. They examine multiple sources, consider author biases, compare contradictory accounts, and distinguish between established fact and reasonable guessing. This intellectual rigor is essential for a genuine understanding of the past. As we near the end of this long journey through the Battle of Montgisard, it is worth summarizing the key lessons we can draw from this extraordinary event. First, material resources and numerical superiority, while helpful, do not guarantee victory. Quality leadership, troop unity, superior intelligence, tactical planning, and execution can overcome quantity disadvantages. Second, overconfidence is one of the deadliest dangers a military commander faces. Saladin, normally cautious and methodical, allowed early success and numerical superiority to make him careless, with catastrophic results. Third, taking initiative and being bold, when based on a realistic view of the situation, can achieve results that a conservative approach never could. Fourth, morale and motivation are powerful forces in military conflict. The Crusaders at Montgisard fought with the belief that they were defending not just an earthly kingdom, but eternal causes. This belief gave them the strength to risk everything against overwhelming odds. Fifth, war is a deeply human thing, shaped by emotions, beliefs, personal relationships, and individual decisions, as much as by material and structural factors. Saladin was a fallible human being. Baldwin was a vulnerable human being, and their human choices shaped the course of events. Sixth, the study of military history is not just about glorifying war or celebrating victories. It's about understanding how human beings behave under extreme pressure, how societies organize and use violence, how individual decisions at critical moments can change historical paths, and how we can learn from past successes and failures. Montgisard offers all of these lessons in abundance. Ultimately, the Battle of Montgisard remains one of the most remarkable examples in military history of victory against seemingly impossible odds. It showed that even in an era of brutal medieval warfare, where strength often determined the outcome, strategic intelligence, exceptional leadership, extraordinary courage, and yes, some luck could combine to produce results that defied rational expectations. It is a story of human triumph over adversity, of will overcoming circumstance, of determination overcoming what seemed inevitable. More than 800 years after the events of that November day in 1177, Montgisard continues to fascinate students of military history, inspire those facing daunting odds, and remind us that the course of history is not predetermined. Individual moments of choice, courage, and action can genuinely make a difference. The young leper king, who led 500 knights against 26,000 soldiers, did not know that his action would be remembered for centuries. He simply did what he believed was necessary, risked everything in the name of his kingdom and his faith, and through a combination of skill and circumstance, achieved the impossible. As we close this detailed story of the Battle of Montgisard and its historical impact, we are faced with a fundamental truth about the human condition. We face challenges that seem impossible to overcome, odds that seem impossible, situations that seem hopeless. The story of Montgisard tells us that even in these circumstances, victory is not necessarily out of reach. That strong leadership, careful planning, courageous execution, and unwavering faith can sometimes achieve the extraordinary. May this story inspire not the glorification of war, but an appreciation of the human capacity for courage, determination, and excellence under pressure. May it remind us both of the terrible cost of conflict and of the possibility of overcoming adversity, and may it encourage us in our own challenges, whatever they may be, to never give up, never accept defeat as unavoidable, never allow odds to prevent us from doing what we believe is right. The Battle of Montgisard was fought over 8 centuries ago, but its lessons remain timeless. This is why we study history, not to live in the past, but to learn from it, to better understand ourselves and the possibilities that exist within the human experience. Baldwin IV, the leper king, Saladin, the ambitious sultan, the courageous Templars, the thousands of soldiers who fought and died. They are all part of our shared human heritage. Their stories deserve to be told, remembered, and thought about. As I end this extensive exploration of one of the most extraordinary moments in medieval history, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the Lord God, Creator of heaven and earth, source of all wisdom and knowledge. I thank you for the opportunity to study and share these fascinating pages of human history, for giving us the ability to learn from the past, and for guiding us in our understanding of the complex fabric of events, decisions, and consequences that shape the historical story. May this historical knowledge make us wiser, more compassionate, and more aware of our own responsibility in shaping the future. May the Lord continue to enlighten our minds and hearts as we seek truth, understanding, and wisdom in all areas of human knowledge. To Him be all glory and honor, now and forever. Amen.